This is the FujiFilm XT4, and this is a camera with a lot of personality. And today I'm going to be giving my in-depth review on it. So let's get into it. The FujiFilm XT4 is quite the camera to look at. It screams nostalgia with its striking two-tone look, chunky dials, and really exudes the aura of the old school cameras of the past. Now, I personally really like the design. I think it definitely stands out from the other cameras out there on the market. Now, don't be fooled by this old school look. You still get all the technology of a modern day camera with some really cool quality of life improvements and some neat features. Alright, so the FujiFilm XT4 is a mirrorless camera, and therefore it's lighter and more compact than its DSLR counterparts. But mirrorless cameras feature their own cons, like an inferior viewfinder as well as battery life, as well as a smaller selection of lenses. The Fuji XT4 uses a 26.1 megapixel X-Trans CMOS 4 sensor with a native sensitivity range of ISO 160 to 12800, and so it is capable of high-resolution photos and video recording. You can shoot 4K footage at 60 frames per second, all the way up to 240 frames per second at full HD. Now, it's important to mention that this camera does use an APS-C format, and so it isn't a full-frame camera, and so footage taken on this device will be cropped. Now, I found that the crop wasn't too much of an issue for me personally and the work that I do, but it is important to mention. You do get an electronic viewfinder, which I don't exactly use as much, as well as a mechanical and electronic shutter. Now, I personally don't use the mechanical shutter as much, and this is because I primarily use this camera for recording 4K footage. And when I do go in and take the occasional photo, I normally use just the electronic shutter. This also increases the longevity of the mechanical shutter. So my advice here would be to really pick your moment when it does come to photography. As far as lenses go, my go-to for this camera is the 15 to 45mm lens. I find it does what I need it to do, and these work off Fuji's X-mount system. You can use other lenses through an adapter, although I just use an existing lens that I got from my FujiFilm XT200. You do get digital image stabilization as well as a digital gimbal feature, which I found worked pretty well. Now, when it comes to focus, you do get single focus, where you can input manually where you want the camera to focus in on, or you have autofocus, which, depending on how far the subject is from the lens of the camera utilizes its software to decide where to actually focus in on. I've honestly had mixed results with this. I mean, sometimes it works flawlessly and I don't even have to think about it twice. And other times, not so much. In fact, sometimes I cannot get this camera to focus for the life of me. And it really is annoying, especially because it slows down your workflow. So yeah, focus on the Fuji XT4 is honestly a hit and miss, depending on the scenario. Now, I mentioned that I don't really use the electronic viewfinder as much, and that's mainly because I like to take full advantage of the 3-inch LCD screen, which, while smaller than the screen on my FujiFilm XT200, is still plenty usable and displays useful information. Alright, so now that I've given you a run-through of the Fuji XT4, let's talk about how it is to actually use on a day-to-day basis. So let's talk about these chunky dials. On the left here, you have your ISO dial, allowing you to set ISO manually, or have the camera automatically set it for you depending on shooting conditions. Along this side, you have the dial for shutter speed, along with the option to again set it to auto, and all the way to the right over here, you have the dial to set exposure. One neat quirk is that you have these little buttons that can lock the dials in place to ensure they don't accidentally change. Now, I really appreciate having these chunky dials that I can quickly adjust when I'm shooting either film or photos. And having these dials representing essential aspects like ISO, shutter speed, and exposure, it really helps make the process a lot more efficient. And I really appreciate this. You also get front command dials for quick and easy adjustments to ISO and exposure, which is always useful for making changes on a whim. So yeah, the layout of these controls and the settings in general have a bit of a learning curve, but I promise you, once you get the hang of it, it really does start to feel natural. Alright, when talking about the LCD touchscreen, I gotta say, one thing that I really like is the ability for full swivel and 360 degrees of motion. Now, this wasn't available on the XT3, and I feel like it's an invaluable feature for vloggers. The touchscreen itself is quite responsive and has decent resolution, so anything displayed on it is crisp and clear. Now, the screen isn't as big as the screen on my XT200, which did make me feel some type of way, but other than that, I have no complaints here. The software on the Fuji XT4 is actually quite good. The UI is easy to navigate, and you won't find yourself stuck in an endless cycle of menu options just to change simple settings. One other neat feature of the Fuji X-T4 is the ability to use two SD cards. It features two SD card slots and you can select which one to use in the settings, which is really handy, especially when shooting raw 4K footage for long periods of time, as you don't have to waste time swapping out cards. Now let's talk about photos and video. So Fuji's sensor is able to boast outstanding image quality. I found that photos were consistently crisp and clear. Now Fujifilm is known for its color science, and while there are many people that may be on the fence about this, I personally was not let down by the photos that the X-T4 took. And so for me, I personally really enjoyed the colors that the X-T4 produced. And so with an excellent sensor that can provide some really crisp images full of detail, whether it's day or night, and an autofocus that when it does work, it honestly leads to some really great shots. So when it comes to nighttime shots, I am pleased to say that when it does come to low light conditions, the X-T4 is able to really stand out here and retain a high amount of detail and quality with each image taken. This is in part thanks to its great sensor. And you'll also be happy to know that shooting film on the Fuji X-T4 is actually quite decent. The camera does have IBIS, in-body image stabilization, and so shooting 4K footage at 30 frames per second on a whim is no problem, as long as you stay within that 20-minute mark. Alright, so this may seem like the perfect camera, right? Well, not exactly. Let's talk about one of the biggest issues with this camera, and that's overheating. Now this camera is rated to go to 30 minutes when shooting 4K footage at 30 frames per second, and at 60 frames per second, 20 minutes. Now this is what the camera's capabilities are on paper. However, with my day-to-day use, I found that it lasts generally around 20 minutes when shooting 4K footage at 30 frames per second. After the 20-minute mark, you get a temperature warning, at which point the camera will then shut down. Now, I feel like this is very important to mention because 10 minutes is quite a lot of time, and it can be the difference between finishing up a shoot right there and then, or having to pack up and shoot again at a later point in time. And this, I feel, is kind of a problem. Now, it is summer here in New Zealand, and so the temperatures are naturally a lot higher, indoors and outdoors, so maybe this has something to do with it. So yeah, with my use, I found that this camera actually lasts around 20 minutes when shooting 4K footage at 30 frames per second. And at 60 frames, you probably could kill the camera in 15 minutes, to be honest. So this has been my review of the Fuji X-T4, and yeah, I find this camera to be very interesting. I really like those chunky dials, which make changing ISO, exposure, or shutter speed really quick and easy. I like that the UI is pretty simple to navigate around, and I like the fact that there are two SD card slots, as well as mappable buttons for specific settings. I like all these things, as well as the image and video quality. But this isn't the perfect camera, and there are a few issues with it, like the overheating, which I think is probably the biggest issue with this camera, as well as focus with this camera, again, which I found to be hit and miss. But if you are looking for a camera which is amazing to look at, has these great dials, and a simple UI which is really nice to navigate around, and has great image and video quality, and you're willing to look past the overheating and focus issues that you get sometimes, then I think this might just be the camera for you. So yeah, this has been my review of the Fuji X-T4. Looks like we're out of time, so I'll catch you in the next one.